This is Evie, and I am here with a follow-up to part one. This is still part one. The first video seems to have gotten cut off. I'm not sure what happened, so I'm recording it again. So this is video 1.2 on why I believe the Church of Christ is a cult, and using the B.I.T.E model to go through different traits and characteristics of the Church of Christ as I experienced it. And I'm not sure if I clarified in the first video or not, but I am talking about the non-institutional Church of Christ, or the NICOC, specifically. So I think that I was on controlling types of clothing and hairstyles, and specifically with women. And I experienced and witnessed, for example, a person might be at a service on Sunday or Wednesday, or even I experienced this at summer camp actually pretty frequently because it's hot and people want to wear shorts. But I remember going to a ladies' day where basically the explanation was given that in Leviticus, the priests were required to wear clothing that covered from their neck and all the way down to their knees. And so because of that example, the expectation is that any woman in the church will cover from their neck down to their knees, so none of that should be exposed. So for example, at summer camp, if a kid had shorts that were higher than their knee, and I don't think this was actually applied equally to between genders. I remember it very, very specifically being applied to girls and to women. And so, yeah, basically being told, like, your shorts are too short, you can't wear those, you need to go change. And not being able to wear, like, sleeveless shirts because the shoulders weren't covered. And certainly not anything that was low cut. So I guess I probably would be okay as far as what you can see that I'm wearing right now. But yeah, a lot of strict rules around clothing, and definitely a lot of correction happening for young women, and I think probably for adult people too, like adult women, if they were new, like probably not people who were raised in the church, but like people who found the Church of Christ later in life and were used to, basically wearing whatever they wanted. They may have discovered that's not the way things work in the Church of Christ. I also feel like most of that was kind of framed as if women are dressing to protect men from lust. So it wasn't really applied to men, but the concept of modesty was very much applied to, within the gender binary, was very much applied to women. And basically, like, if you don't follow it, then you could be causing a man to sin, which then is a sin yourself. The next one is major time spent with group indoctrination, rituals, or self-indoctrination, including the internet. And where I see that show up is just like the amount of time that's required to actually be considered not forsaking the assembly. That's what the phrase that would be used in the Church of Christ, forsaking the assembly, which means skipping the services. So I feel like on any given year, you could easily be either at the church building or at some church event nearly every day. Certainly there were days off here and there, but the basic thing is to attend Sunday morning services, Sunday evening services, and those would be, Sunday morning would be like a Bible class, and then the actual like worship service with everyone. And Bible class is basically Sunday school for those of you who don't know. But so Bible class, the worship service, and then a sermon, and then the invitation, depending on like whether people come forward or not. I'll talk more about that in another video. And then there's a break on Sunday, usually 3 or 4 hours or so, and then there's a second service in the evening that faithful members are expected to come to, which is basically a repeat of the morning service, but just without Bible class. So on Sunday, for all intents and purposes, you're basically either at church all day, because the break is not really long enough to do anything besides like maybe eat lunch or take a nap. And I always feel like as a kid I had to decide, especially as a teenager, I had to decide whether I was going to take a nap or eat lunch, because it didn't feel like there was time for both. And then there are other events. Oh, so that's the services. And then other required services are Wednesday evenings, which usually are somewhere between 7 and 9. It's a pretty late night for kids, especially on a weeknight, and even for adults who have to get up and go to work the next day. And so outside of those like 3 weekly services, there are like devotionals, oftentimes either an actual study that is set up to like for recruiting new members, or members studying together, usually like members that have been a part of the church for a long time and new members kind of mixed together so that they're indoctrinating the newer people. And then there are gospel meetings, which is basically like when a congregation has a preacher come from out of town, and those can be, usually they're in the evening. I've seen them more recently like being on a weekend, like a Friday through Sunday, where it's like a Friday evening, basically all day Saturday and then Sunday. I think probably because people are having to work more now than they were when I was growing up, and so they don't have time to like come to the church building like for 5 evenings during the week. But growing up, that's definitely what we were doing for if there's a gospel meeting. And not only is there the gospel meetings that are happening at one's own home congregation, but any congregations in the area, there's kind of the expectation that if you're really faithful that you'll be going to those gospel meetings as well. And then there's youth days, which usually is like on a Saturday, and it would be like all day from like 8 to 4. And ladies' days, so since women are not able to teach when men are present, they have their own separate thing, like kind of lecture. I don't really know what else you would call it and outside of the Church of Christ, but they call it a ladies' day, basically where you are speaking, or there's a woman who's speaking, whether it's a woman from that congregation or a local congregation that's nearby, or whether they have someone come from out of town, and usually it's kind of an all-day thing too. And then there's vacation Bible schools, which happen usually 1 week throughout the summer, and they're mostly aimed at kids, but there's also things for adults while the kids are in there. It's basically like Sunday school, but just at night and like with snacks and stuff. And then again, you would be expected to go to your vacation Bible school, but also to vacation Bible schools for the congregations that are nearby. So that's could be anywhere from like 3 to 4 weeks throughout the summer that you're going like basically every night. And then there's summer camp, which at least in this region, there was a summer camp that a lot of the churches would go to, and that would pretty much go throughout the summer. So a lot of adults would be there through multiple weeks, and that's like, I mean, you're sleeping there. It's like all day. And then there are lectureships which happen in different parts of the country, and people will travel to those different parts of the country to attend the lectureships. So, I mean, it really is a lot, and like, the reason that I was able, or our family was able to go to all those things eventually as I got older, was because we were homeschooled. Because otherwise, they would have had to pull us out of school. There were parents who did that, but a lot of times when I would go to the lectureships, and like when we would travel to go to these, like, a lectureship is basically a conference where you're like, people are just different preachers are just like preaching all day long for like 3-4 days or perhaps even a week. The only kids that I usually saw at lectureships were other homeschooled kids in the Church of Christ. So I mean, it's a lot of commitment. There's door knocking as well. I'm sure I'm forgetting something. So if you remember something that I haven't named, feel free to add that in the comments. So yeah, lots of things. Thoughts, feelings, and activities of self or other reported to superiors. So, yeah, I remember feeling really distrustful of other people in the church, particularly as a teenager when I started having a lot more questions and didn't feel satisfied with people just telling me I wasn't allowed to ask them. But the first time I remember being kicked out of Sunday school or Bible class, I was actually only 5 years old. They were talking about the Lord's Supper, which is required in the Church of Christ to be taken every single Sunday. And otherwise it's like a sin, like you have to do it. And I remember I asked, like, what happens if someone's allergic to grapes? And apparently I was not allowed to ask that. The teacher got really upset and kicked me out of the class, and it's like it was really humiliating because it was in front of all the other kids, and my mom had to like come get me, and then I was in trouble. So yeah, like those sorts of things, as well as like perhaps having a private conversation with somebody and then having another member come and say like, oh, so and so said that you had questions about this, like what's going on, and kind of like making it feel like they're suspicious of you, like why are you asking these questions, are you trying to like lead this person astray? And so it made me really not trust anyone. So at a certain point, I remember in high school, I just like stopped having real conversations with anyone who was in the Church of Christ, because if I expressed how I really felt or I expressed any doubts or questions, I was worried about it, like, getting back to my parents. I suspect with social media now, that's probably also the case. There was no social media when I was growing up, so I didn't have to deal with that, thankfully. But definitely heard about people getting reported, like, people reporting conversations that happened when I was at the Church of Christ College in Tennessee. The next one is rewards and punishments used to modify behaviors, both positive and negative. I think this is probably mostly used for children, if it's not just like kind of like social exclusion or like, being allowed to, for men, I know there was prestige associated with things like being a song leader, being able to lead like the opening prayer, being able to teach a Bible class. Like only certain people in congregations were allowed to do that, and it pretty much went along with like your popularity or status, or like how righteous you were perceived to be. And certainly getting an office in the church, not literally an office like in like a room, but like an office like being a deacon or an elder, would be a reward for following the rules in an overt way more closely. The imposing of rigid rules and regulations, definitely the case. I mean, a few of them I've mentioned. The just having kind of the rules about clothes and about not asking questions. The two things that are popping up in my mind that are the most clear about rigid rules and regulations are definitely the plan of salvation, which is like the five, actually maybe 6 steps that a person has to follow in order to be saved, and without doing those things you're not saved. And then the second thing would be the 5 acts of worship, which I'm not sure I remember all of them. It's been a while since I thought about them. But the to begin, the plan of salvation, first is to hear the word of God, and the caveat to that is that it needs to be from somebody who's in the Church of Christ. It doesn't count if you've heard it from somewhere else outside of the Church of Christ. To believe everything that you're told, so believe what you're taught without any doubts, and to hear, believe, repent, which means, we're taught in the Church of Christ to repent means to like turn away from your former life and like the bad choices and sins that you made before, and to live in a righteous life. So basically it's like, turning your direction and going towards God instead of towards the devil. Very, very much black and white kind of thinking there. Confess. So the confession is kind of twofold. Confess that you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and to confess your sins. So I would say like the last 3 steps of the plan of salvation, if we're doing 6, are the ones you have to keep repeating over and over again. So confession is definitely one of those, particularly confessing sins. And then the key, which, because up until the confession, I think that's not too terribly different than a lot of other, like, regular, like, Protestant churches. But where the Church of Christ differs is that they require baptism for salvation. So if you have not been baptized, and in the Church of Christ, being baptized means being fully immersed underwater. Every part of your body has gone under the water. Nothing can be sticking up. That's actually, like, I have heard of people getting baptized again because, like, maybe their finger didn't go all the way down or their leg popped up or something like that. They make a really big deal about every single part of your body needs to be fully submerged. There's no pouring, there's no sprinkling. And in order to be baptized, you have to have reached the age of accountability for it to count. So there's no infant baptism. And I would say, like, children under, like, 9 or 10 probably don't get baptized most of the time. It probably happens here and there, but, like, most of the time, I would say kids wouldn't be baptized before they're 9 or 10 years old. And then the last step is to live faithfully. And that has been tacked on because it's just a way of letting people know that you can't just get baptized and, like, kind of slack off. You have to live a righteous life, otherwise you will lose your salvation. And so where I was saying the 3 need to be repeated, basically it's like you have to keep confessing your sins. You don't have to be baptized again, but you definitely have to, like, live faithfully. Part of that is included in living faithfully is not forsaking the assembly or skipping church. So you have to keep coming every time the doors are open. You need to participate in some sort of evangelism activity, and you need to just continually be checking and making sure that you're, like, not, sinning and forgetting or not repenting, because any wrong thought or behavior that you do could cause you to lose your salvation. So a lot of fear wrapped around that, which we'll talk about with, particularly I think with the thought control with the T in another video, and also with the emotion control. The last 2, instill dependency and obedience. and encourage and engage in corporal punishment. I feel like these particularly apply to women and children. The instilling dependency and obedience. So, for example, if you're a woman and the church is having a business meeting, you're not allowed to go. And so, the only way that you can know what the church is doing, for example, like with the money or like anything that they're planning, like you can't have any input whatsoever if you're a woman, and certainly not if you're a child. But you wouldn't even know what was going on in the business meetings unless you're married and your husband was going. So if your husband's not going to the business meeting, or if you're like a single woman and you don't have a husband who can go, then basically you're just not fully included. You also, as a woman, can't like lead singing or teach. And women aren't even allowed to teach like teenage boys. Like once the boys get to be about 12 or 13, it would be considered like usurping authority for a woman, especially if the boy was baptized already. It would be considered usurping authority in the Church of Christ for you to for a woman to teach a boy. And so in Bible class after 12 or 13, all of the teachers are males, so no women are allowed to teach teenagers unless they've divided the classes by gender and it's just girls in the class. There is a lot of emphasis placed on obedience, and I'll talk about this more in another video, but if you're in the Church of Christ, you will be familiar with the stories of Uzzah, Nadab, and Abihu, and what was the third person? Oh, Elisha and the kids with the sheep hairs. So I'm going to actually share those stories in another video, but just using that as an example, that these are stories that are told to children over and over again. They're actually horrifying stories about people being murdered by God for being disobedient. And there's stories that are repeatedly drilled into children to remind them that if you don't follow God's rules exactly right, even if your intention is right, I heard people say, you can be sincere, but you could be sincerely wrong. So it's like, it doesn't really matter what your intention is. What really matters to God, according to the Church of Christ teaching, is that you do everything perfectly. And so that's the measure by which people are judged as being righteous or not in practical matters. Now, of course, like, were you talking to a person in the Church of Christ, they wouldn't come right out and say that. But I grew up in the Church of Christ and was part of it for 23 years, and that's actually what happens. Like, you could have all the sincerity in the world, but if you're not doing everything perfectly, then people will consider you to have sinned or to be doing things wrong, and they won't consider you to be faithful. You also could be harboring all sorts of animosity in your heart and be doing everything as perfectly, way maybe more perfectly than someone who's sincere. And those are going to be the people who are celebrated. Those are the people who will get the offices of deacon and elder. Those will be the women who get to speak on ladies' days. And those will be the people who are held up as examples. Really are the people who are doing actions that look as perfect as they can. And so that creates an environment where there's a lot of hypocrisy. If you actually start getting to know people on a deeper level and seeing like, wow, this person like puts on a good show, but they don't actually seem like a quality human being. Like, they seem really resentful and like cruel. And I feel like there's a lot of narcissist in the Church of Christ, and that kind of makes sense because the way that God is presented is a very narcissistic God, like somebody who wants all of the attention. They have these really unreasonable high expectations. They feel like everyone is there to like serve and worship you, and that if they don't do everything perfectly to your liking, then you might literally murder them. Like, so I mean, that sounds so extreme, but the way that God is presented in the Church of Christ really isn't loving at all. And what I remember being told is that love looks like respect, and love looks like obedience, and love looks like fear. And so that kind of goes with like the rigid rules and instilling dependency and obedience. Um, there's more to that, but like on a basic level, that's really what it's about, is like just being perfect. And that's literally not possible. So it creates a lot of stress and anxiety for lots of people who are genuinely trying to do the right thing. And honestly, it kind of seems like my experience in the Church of Christ, were the people who seemed the least stressed out, were the people who their heart wasn't really in it, but they were really good at faking it and just like following the rules to a T. So that's gonna be the video for the first letter of the B.I.T.E model, B, behavior control, and we'll cover way more in the other videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.